Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our think tank, where we brainstorm ideas for role-playing games, monsters, adventures, and all sorts of things like that. Right, joining us tonight, as we will be putting together a monster, is Jay, Josh, and Kieran. So let's get started, so we can dive straight in. First things first, let's do a quick check-in, find out how everyone's been this week. So, quick 30-second check-in, please, from Jay.
Right, how's my week been? Busy. Oh dear God, so very been running around at work, making sure that people can stop asking me questions. Basically, where I sit, and it's one of those weeks where a lot of stuff has kind of collided together, which basically means people keep asking me questions. Where is this? When is this happening? What's this doing? Have you got information on this? So yesterday I hid in the lab.
Hiding is always a good plan at work.
It does.
Okay.
It does. I hid in a lab, which greatly reduced the number of questions, particularly because I didn't tell anyone where I was.
A cunning plan. Excellent. So, Jay, Josh, how's your week been?
Again, busy. Very, very, very busy. We just had a new system put in at work, which is great because half the addresses from the warehouse dispatch won't go in. On back to related role-playing notes, I visited my partner in crime, and we had a good discussion about, again, further world building, which then culminated into how do these two races of how does this race of nanotechnological creatures procreate? It's a very, very interesting conversation that's not going to be shared here just yet. It's basically just world building. We've started to do a few stats here and there, but nothing concrete. I did get introduced to the monster making paths by Pat on Saturday, so hopefully in the near future I'm going to good play around with that and start statting creatures. So world building and starting to get a bit more used to the building system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant. I mean, I think it's the bit I like is sort of when you come up with an idea and saying, oh, we'll have monsters which do X, and then you start thinking, well, how did that happen, and what effect does that have on the rest of the life? And I think that's when you get a really exciting, rich world, is when you actually think of the consequences or the causes of your actions.
Exactly.
Okay, brilliant, Josh. Kieran, how's your week been?
It's not been too bad, really, so far. It's been relatively relaxing, even though I've been at work, which is a headache at the best of days. I've been looking around for more sort of inspirational sources about how to approach where I'm going to go in the world I'm writing, and oddly enough, it's taken a turn towards reading and watching Penny Dreadful, which has been a really interesting source of weird Victorian old age world into semi-modern world transitional stuff. There are some interesting ideas in there behind that on the technology side, along with sort of doing some reading of some stuff being done by a couple of writers with the same kind of ideas I've had. So it's sort of build sort of a more knowledge building out, meeting the information grab at to build the world I'm working on.
Well, but I mean that's the essential spade work, isn't it? At the beginning of a project, is just research, and it'll pay dividends in the long run. So excellent. So you sound like you've had a good week. My week has been pretty good, like everyone else. Busy, but I've got a lot done. Finished typesetting pretty much on Outbreak and on the generic modern books. I also finished something else, I forget, whatever I was working on previously. And I've done the covers for Outbreak, and I've done the map for Outbreak. As normal with this creative work, it sort of always takes longer than I want, so it's due to a bit of time. But I spent probably about a day and a half doing a sort of a 3D-ish type isometric map of the Outbreak house, and then I spent, well, basically all of today doing the new cover for Outbreak, which I'm really pleased with the outcome. I really, really like the cover. So yeah, good week. Busy but good. Okay, so right, that's been our weeks. Let's talk monsters. I shared out this image from on what was it, Thursday, wasn't it? On G+, and it went out on Facebook and Twitter, etc. if you're watching this, the link's in the notes. You can go and have a look at the image. But it's a sort of tall figure striding away what looks to be a city in the background. It's got a huge, impractical-looking sort of polearm axe type arrangement, and it seems to have sort of like a technological helmet and chest piece. So that's sort of our image. I chose this image because while it's by a different artist, it's similar in style to the image we looked at last week, and I was thinking about whether we can put together these two monsters into one package. Now, let's have a quick look at some of the comments we got back on G+, where we had some really, really good feedback. One of the Ingo suggested a combat golem, and I think sort of a golem creature sort of got mentioned a couple of times by people, so some sort of construct. But sort of like the idea which really ran out through lots of people's responses was cyborg, part flesh, part technology creatures. There's some, either they're aliens or they're sort of humans coming through, have been adapted, or some are very, very heavy technological, some are sort of mostly flesh. So lots of sort of like different ideas and concepts which came through from that. One particularly pick out is Ben Gerber, who kicked in some great ideas, and it's more sort of like it's a robot. It's some monster which was created, fighting monster which was created eons ago, which is still around, and it's programmed to fight, and that's all it does. It just wanders around fighting in armies, being in danger. Like it's almost like a force of nature wandering around causing chaos, and it's incredibly good at what it does. But one of the touches I did like was that the red cloak which it's wearing was wrapped around it. Ben has put as that actually this isn't it dressed, it's a flag of a defeated enemy which it's just got entangled up in, and that's given it its name of Red Cloak, and it's this sort of semi-mythological monster wandering around. That was a really good idea. And Jim Hansen also came up with a really completely different take, in that it's a psychological monster that you project onto it your fears or whatever else, and that decides how it looks. So we are seeing it like this because of our culture. But he was saying that it sort of pulls on your fears from childhood, because he points out that the image is slightly skew-width in terms of perspective. So it's like you're looking up at it, like a small child looking up at an adult, and that's the sort of like fear it inflicts on its enemies. So there's some really, really good ideas I liked. So I thought, well, what do we think of those ideas? Let's start with Jay.
It's interesting. The idea of it being basically whatever you think it looks like, whatever it fears is basically a bit of a cop-out, because you could have used any image and then come up with that response. The prompt I think he was running off with was the idea of you being the perspective angle, because it's scaling on the background doesn't give it a great deal of indication of how tall it is, but it looks normal size. It looks about 6 foot or so. So the fact you're looking your eye level with its waist doesn't I can see where he was going with that. The other one of the unstoppable robot, I quite like the idea it's the remnant of an ancient army. So, or it's the remnant of some kind of army. So you could easily imagine it standing in formation with thousands of perfectly other identical units. And over the course of perhaps centuries, it's now the last one left. You have no guarantees that the war it was fighting is still even going on.
Yeah, so it's sort of like some Star Wars battle droid, 2,000 years after that planet's been abandoned, sort of level of technology. Yeah, that's sort of a good take. Okay, Josh, how about you?
It's definitely some form of cyborg. Those parts, I mean, especially if you look at the knee. they look like they've been added on. The way they look, there's no feet for a start, so it does look like partially mechanical. And the thing on the chest definitely looks like some kind of power source, some internal reactor or some energy that's keeping it going. Briefly on the height, the lack of perspective is a fair point. It does look like it's a giant moving towards you, but it does really need an object near it to give us a sense of size. So it could very easily be giant, or it could be small. But yeah, the flag is an interesting idea. I'm curious as to how they managed to get the reactor over it, if indeed it's a reactor.
Yes.
That seems a bit. The flag wrapped around it's cool, but you got to think of the practicality of putting the reactor then over the flag. If it's just been draped around it, then it's not. It's going to have it over the reactor, at which point you can't see said energy source.
I mean, that's a fair point. That's the thing is, if you are building a monster around the image, it does have to actually make sense with the image, of course.
Yeah, though that possibly could just be a critique of the image. It's really small on mine. I don't know why. One second. Zoom in.
So you just muted yourself, Josh.
Sorry. Human though, if that makes sense. The helmet itself looks a bit. It's probably because I'm looking at it from a weird angle, but it looks kind of canine, maybe, or
with that sort of snout.
Yeah, or that could just be part of the respirator. It's certainly possibly got a pointed head. Definitely old though. I'd definitely go with old, even if the handle to that pole arm halberd weapon looks a bit flimsy. That's just.
It's high technology,
Super strong.
Carbon fibre. Okay, it's great, Josh. Kieran, what do you think?
I've been thinking about it for a while listening to everyone else, and I'm brought back to an idea from a Star Trek episode from the Next Generation, sort of, I think season 1 or season 2, I think it is, of a society that had built up a utopia on the backs of genetically engineered soldiers to fight their wars, with implants in there. And then afterwards the soldiers had been exiled as prisoners because they were deemed too dangerous to return back to normal society. So when I think of this kind of image, I think of that kind of idea. There's actually was a soldier who fought in a war, defending the city, defending the home, and during that course he's been upgraded and enhanced and modified to be a better fighting machine. And bits have been sort of attached to him to replace things he's lost as well. And then the war's over, and now he's been released, he's been banished because he's no longer needed, because their society doesn't need something like that anymore. So he's just left with what's left on him. I mean, to me, I can see bits of tear and wear on the cloak he's wearing. So maybe it is actually sort of a uniform piece, like a long dress tunic shirt that's just been worn and torn by his combat experience. Some of the bits of the imagery for the arms and the legs, especially with the legs and the shadowy parts, look like they're actually missing pieces, or like there should have been more there to make whole pieces of a leg. So it could be just this is what's left after his abandonment, after his leaving. It's just him walking away into to find his own purpose now he's been exiled from his own society. So sort of a less monster, more wandering NPC that can be a dangerous opponent because he is a veteran and he is more powerful than a normal soldier would be. Because he is wearing a helmet. That's definitely a helmet-looking thing on top in comparison to more cybernetic aspects. And that chest piece sort of that's been seen as a reactor, I'd see that more like a shield generator, something like that, something that just projects out a defensive field. That kind of thing. That's how I visualize that image.
Yeah, there's yes, that's interesting. And you mentioned there it's sort of like an old soldier, and well, a couple of people mentioned in comments also that implied was that this is less a monster than it's an NPC. And I'll throw this open to anyone. What are our thoughts? In terms of more rather than monster, something with a bit more character, something more individual.
I can go with that. That works for me. I mean, there's an awful lot of little contradictions in this character. think a couple worth pointing out. I mean, first off, the significant level of armor and cybernetics we're going for, but he's still wearing this quite strong, thick fabric cloak. So you've got to ask yourself, well, if he is robotic, why is he wearing some form of clothing? You've also got the technology divide between his equipment and his weapon. Any society to technology advanced enough, well, our society has projectile weaponry, and we don't even have this level of cybernetics. So obviously, for some reason, that is an effective weapon in the fighting culture he comes from. So
it's purely ceremonial.
True, and it could simply be that he used to be a ceremonial guard and he is now nomadic. But something that Kieran was saying, I think, given where he is, where he's walking, the posture, nomadic is a good adjective I think I want to apply to this guy. And I think you could spend an awful lot of time world building off just the fact that he's got this melee weapon and still has either cybernetics or power armor or is a robot. That saying, the big thing on the front being a shield generator works quite well. I also quite like that. I mean, that immediately thought Dune.
Oh yes, yeah, that sort of environmental suit sort of thing.
Well, in Dune, they have shields and they have laser weaponry, but you can't fire a laser weapon at a shield because it destroys both in an annihilation field. So everything is done by melee weapons because they've forgotten how to use bullets.
Yeah.
Because the slow weapon pierces the shield, whereas the fast weapon bounces off, or say, the obliteration field. So it's the interesting counter to a ranged conflict in a modern society.
Yeah, is that everyone wears personal shields, so you have to fight with swords.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If you start with that one idea, is how do you have a high-tech society where you have to fight with melee weapons, and extrapolate from there. You would end up with a very interesting setting. Which, going on from that point, as I mentioned at the beginning, I picked this image because it resonated with last week's image. I mean, last week's image also had a red cloak and was sort of like, armored figure type with a melee weapon. So last week we brainstormed that monster and we came up with some ideas. Now, I was meant to go away and create a monster with that, but that didn't happen for various reasons. However, Jay has. So I thought it would be interesting, Jay, if you sort of run us quickly through the sort of couple of monsters you have spec'd up, and then we sort of come back to this week's monster and then see how that guides us in terms of developing.
So I had two ideas in addition to the that were made. I took two ideas that were mentioned in the meeting. One of the general, the old warrior, and Mark's idea, my brother's idea of some kind of blood spirit. Just kind of ran with them a bit. Now, the general of the Red Banner, I'll just read with the text I've got here, is a loyal military commander of the Sand Elves, a fanatic believer in elven supremacy. He's been at the forefront of the desolate empire's expansion across much of the western continent. Fighting with his infantry, his huge blood-red cloak perpetually catches the wind, proclaiming his presence on the battlefield. He was greatly wounded at the siege of Rockhold, losing his arm in a cavalry charge. Such were his injuries, he commanded his mages to seal him inside his armour to hold his battered body together. The spell fused his black armour to him, making it part of him and imprisoning him in it. So yeah, I went with a much darker tone on that. I mean, he's very much a bad guy. He's the kind of character that the NPCs would encounter at the very end of our campaign, having fought his agents and his soldiers for quite a long time. I threw a lot of cards at him. He's got military service as a path, intelligent, he's a fanatic, he's incredibly well equipped. So yeah, I'll pause talking there and let people have a respond to that idea.
Josh, what do you think of that?
Definitely some form of leader. He's big, he's imposing, and generally looks like he commands respect, if not rules through fear. Also, it could be that he's essentially like the dragon to the leader, to throw a little tropish in there. So he's the big guns. He's the creature that the leader would send in if they were getting particularly hammered at a certain point. If they can't take it with normal troops, we send in this black armored knight with enough power and enough reputation that it just break their morale and subsequently break the enemy.
Yeah, that sort of that heavy hitting creature. So yeah, that sort of works. Kieran, have you got any thoughts on that first idea?
Yeah, well, the one I had was the idea of a sort of similar to what Mark had from last week, but I hadn't seen his notes yet. So it's kind of an entity trapped in a golem, whether it's a human or something like that, and this entity is full of anger and rage about knowing it's trapped out of a body, and the fact it's had its life taken from it, it's had the choice of death taken away from it, and that anger fuels the actual golem itself in a mystical connection between it and the armor. And whenever it's close to sort of killing a victim, rather than just outright destroying it, a magical tendril kind of emits from that hole in the body to rip into the body, to drain out the energy within the dying man, to keep feeding that anger and that rage inside. So it relies on the spiritual energy of the anger, but it burns it out. So it has to keep fueling it with everything it kills.
That sort of feeds into your second monster, doesn't it, Jay?
Yeah, which is the summoned blood spirit. Summoned by powerful magic from planes of existence unknown, these spirits thirst for blood. The ritual that creates them requires the blood of an innocent, painfully spilled onto the runes of summoning. Spirit feasts upon the blood of their fallen victims, becoming larger and stronger as they drink more, as they draw the iron out of the blood and use it to bond into their blood iron armor. The great cloak below behind it as the spirit floats, making no sound as it moves and glides emotionlessly across the battlefield. The only emotion they express is glee at a new source of blood. Unaging, they often outlive those who summoned them and take to wandering the wilds once more once they are no longer bound. The most powerful of these evil creatures are those summoned in anger by a loved one of the innocent killed, giving it horrid vengeance upon the killer.
Oh, that sounds very good. I like that.
Starts about yay big.
and grows as it sucks in
And
more.
as it kills, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So you could scale it. So you could say for a minor dungeon fight where you've only got a little one, and it's dangerous and a bit nasty, but it's only a little one. Several episodes down the later, they find one that's 7 foot tall.
Yeah. And then there's quite, you could sort of like nicely signpost the dungeon, effectively almost what level are you? It depends on how big the creature is you're fighting. That's a good one. Yeah, I think just extrapolating from that, I can imagine a world where that's the only thing left. It's absolutely, it's almost sort of touching this into space. It's so big, but everything else on the planet is dead.
Josh has just posted the idea of someone that was 20 to 30 feet tall, and you can imagine that, for example, someone summoning it after a city had been sacked. But there's hundreds of potentially thousands of innocents being killed, and then you summon a vengeance one of these, and it just comes out of all the blood and then stands above the city, and is like, well, I'm going home.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be good. Josh, have you thoughts on that take off on the monster?
Oh, sweet Jesus. It's terrifying to think you've introduced your players to this sprite-sized knight, and then they're going to think it's a threat. They're going to think it's something they're going to swat down, and eventually they start encountering them bigger and bigger to the point where they're no longer a joke. They are the biggest threat they have ever faced. Something that could easily result in a total party wipeout if they weren't careful or very, very well prepared.
I mean, sorry, go on.
The colossal one rising out of the ashes of the city is even more terrifying. I mean, the heroes failed to stop the bad guys ransacking the city. Look what you've just released. It's gigantic, and it's coming for the next city, and then the next one, and more could be summoned until you've got a walking army of these colossal blood knights.
Yeah, that's a real sort of end of the world. For some reason, I'm seeing it very much in an anime style, in Guy Who Did My Neighbor Totoro and all of those sort of animes. I forget the name of those films now. Yeah. But I like that. I like the idea of sort of colossal ones that it's growing. What is interesting is that both Jay's things involved magic, and I think when we talked through last week's monster was a very magical monster. I think really all the ideas focused on magic. This week we're really much talking about a lot more technological creation. I'm just wondering, does anyone think these do fit together, or they definitely don't fit together?
I'd argue they could very easily be science versus magic. Maybe if we could group them together, maybe the current monster is the answer to these magics. Something that was created that can't have its life force drained to actively combat these blood knights.
Oh, good idea.
Something that can get close enough to fight them in melee combat.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. You know, if you've got a blood-sucking monster, well, create soldiers which don't have blood.
Exactly.
And anyone else got some thoughts on the magic versus technology side?
It's an interesting idea, definitely. I like what Josh has just brought up, certainly. And something, because I've been doing a lot of researching on something else, one of the things I'm looking at has been Numenera, Monty Cook's new sci-fi fantasy book. And in there, technology and magic are effectively the same thing, because most magic's made by nanotech and appears as magic. Because it's all technology left behind from previous ages of the world that people know the most basic ways of using, but don't know how to make it or how to sort of make it better. So everything is to a degree magical, but there is things like cybernetics and that can work along with the idea of the magic. So those two being in that kind of world together works perfectly as an imagery. And I can see that working fantastically together, sort of alongside by side. I could almost see this week's creature being sort of like a foot soldier equivalent, kind of a frontline skirmisher for the blood spirit creature coming on from behind, so to come in to sort of take the lethal blow from something to gain that power as it's moving through. Whereas these are like bodyguards or frontline soldiers to keep them from being killed too early before they develop into the monstrous siege creatures they could become.
That's an interesting point, is that if you have a creature which you summon, it starts off really small and you have to effectively feed it to grow it big, then you need something to protect it and help it, really, I suppose, find the blood. So yeah, that's an interesting idea, that they're actually foot soldiers or they interact. So yeah, we've got this, we can put them together on the same side, and almost like a pair, or we can put them as sort of opposites to each other. I think Josh has commented in the chat that, you know, that we could have two societies, or maybe two continents of the same world, one taking a path towards magic and one taking a path towards technology, and of course inevitably they're going to meet and they're going to have clash of cultures and probably lay waste to the world, which would be sort of a great sort of background for a very sort of, you know, Numenera, but also, you know, hugely lots of different ideas mixed together sort of setting. Okay, that's. I think we've got some great ideas for that. I think rather than pushing on to actually picking some paths out for that monster, I think we'll leave it there unless anyone's got any last-minute thoughts to chuck in about this week's monster.
I just about the third option. I would keep them separate. They are stylistically, they are very similar monsters. The pattern of red cloak and melee weapon does make them, they look similar. But there's just something about the two different images just makes me think they are from just entirely different realities. They're from different stories. They just, yeah, to me they don't seem like they're from the same part of from the same continuity. It's just, yeah. I could probably tell an awful lot of stories. I mean, if nothing else, the image we've got right now, you could almost use it as a description of a player character.
Yes, I think it's a lot more of a characterful image than sort of last week's. I think because last week's was very much definitely a suit of armour, and that's what puts in mind mass-produced or at least numerous. So, but yeah, that's a good idea. Josh?
Had an idea at the start, which also very briefly tags into Kieran's idea. If we're going for a possible character, maybe a major NPC, maybe he was an old war hero, either died on the battlefield or was brought back using technology to fight the war they were sent into. Almost like very similar to the last creature, but more of a he's the dead brought back to serve the living. Those cybernetics are what are keeping him together.
Yeah, I mean,
kind of tragically maybe.
Yes, I was just thinking that there's an interesting question. You know, you can't die. You know, if you're sort of like this great general, you know, let's say we had a Wellington equivalent and then we had the technology to bring people back. You know, every time the society's in crisis, they just resurrect this poor sod who just wants to be dead, you know, left in peace. And so he's constant. All he ever comes back for is to fight another bloody war. And so actually, you know, he's desperate to be destroyed and not to be killed, but he can't be. So that'd be an interesting storyline to follow.
It's possibly why he has a melee weapon. In a society where indeed could have projectile weapons, he prefers to get up close and personal because it guarantees him the possibly dying. That makes sense, because he has to rush towards the opponent, and the best way to do that is with a melee weapon. But possibly because of either the cybernetics or maybe he's just that good, he can't die. No matter how close he gets, no matter how many enemies he chews through using that halberd, it's just not enough.
Yeah, I mean that sort of touches on the things. You know, why has he got the axe? And yeah, it could be actually that, you know, that was his original weapon. He actually dates back thousands and thousands of years to when actually that was a viable weapon, and he's just come back and come back and come back. So yeah, I think there's lots of character in this week's image we could explore. So that's great. Okay, so let's wrap up there. On that, what we need to do is decide what we're going to brainstorm next week. Pat and Em, I believe, will be back by then, but obviously they can't run anything because they're not here. So open to you guys. What sort of role-playing problems would you like to bring to the table?
If I possibly could throw some suggestions at you guys about some of the creatures and possible characters in my universe, and see how we can put your guys' perspectives on them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean that'd be interesting. Yeah, I mean if you feel up to, we'll have to learn a bit about your universe, but that might be a good way of doing it. If you sort of
I'll write up either a vague species guide beforehand and release it on Google Plus several days before the meeting, I think description.
Yeah, I think because we'll be coming in completely this cold, so we know nothing about your universe and things like that. So maybe probably a good starting point and a good way to get people involved on the net would be if you just put together, I don't know, maybe only 200, 300 words, just giving some broad encapsulation of your universe, of the world you're creating. And then the open question can be, what sort of monsters would you want to encounter, you know, or are going to exist in there? And we can start from a very top level, because then that means we don't have to know much about your world.
Yes, that's one of the few things. We've only got a few enemies, if that makes sense. We've definitely somehow managed to create a lot of very high level enemies, because we're very excitable like that. But not much basic, so help with basic enemies would definitely be a good use.
Well, that sounds brilliant. Okay, so we have a plan for next week. Josh, yeah, if you can get that out and email us, and then we can share it all out on Facebook and Twitter and everything, that'll be brilliant. And next week you'll be chairing the meeting and running us through our discussion. So that's brilliant. Okay, we have a plan. So that's about it for the meeting. Only thing to wrap up is our pluses and deltas. Which is where we say one thing we liked about the meeting, and also one thing we would like to change or do differently next time, or something like that. And we'll have pluses and deltas at the same time. So I'm going to start with Jay. What's your plus and what's your delta?
Plus, I'm always going to enjoy getting stuck in with coming up with creative ideas, and just basically going, okay, right, well, let's take this blank canvas and start painting images on it. So I enjoyed that. Deltas, I think it would be good on one occasion to start with a fully formed idea or a partially formed idea, and then really throw some 66 system at it and see where we get from that. Now, with the monster we've just discussed, if we were going to do that, I think we'd be almost taking up more parts from Modern Generic than we would be from the monster deck. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see, because there's a little bit of a cybernetics gap in the path, so it might have been tricky to do it with this one. But yeah, Delta, it would have been nice to get some cards and some advantages down on the monster, but I think other than that, yeah, I'm okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Josh.
Plus, it's always, again, very similar to what Jay said. It's always great to see how many fresh perspectives we can get on just one image. We can start from something and then skew into something completely new. I know I said that wrong, didn't I? Segue?
No, I understood what you want. Yeah, it's that sort of like, you know, your path wanders and you bounce off ideas off each other, and that's what's fun about brainstorming.
Yes. Delta, still very new to this, so I'm very hesitant to say many deltas, because I'm fine with that. I've got absolutely no problem with the way these are run. So, yeah, I think we could, when it comes to the whole, has anybody got any ideas, what we could do is, if we could go in chat, say, I have an idea, or I have an idea, and then we sort out a running order of how we go through those ideas.
That's an excellent idea. So yeah, if we make more use of the chat to sort of flow the basically a sort of putting your hand up mechanic is really what we want. So yeah, we could do that. So that's a great idea. Okay, brilliant. Kieran, what's your plus and your delta?
Right, my plus for me was actually just having a look at this week's monster, not just leaving it to being this week's, just looking at last week's as comparative talk to see the differences in the ideas, and sort of always bringing in what we've just recently discussed into the current meeting, so we can keep generating that fresh idea. That was nice. I liked that idea.
And your delta?
My note-taking skills are really rusty, so I've had to really sort of, am I doing it here, am I doing it there? So for me, sort of getting used to note-taking in a conversation again, that's more of a me thing more than a meeting thing.
No, I mean, this is not the sort of thing to bring up because it is challenging, and, you know, one of the things we've got to look at is the workload note-taking makes, and also what do we need to record and what don't we need to record. So that's something we can look at.
I think I did okay at the end of the day, but took me a while to get into the flow going, right, this goes there, that goes there, I've got to do this. Right, I've got to talk now, hold on.
Yeah, that's the hardest thing, because you're busy focused on one thing and then I ask you a question. Okay, oh yeah, so I suppose I'm going to do mine. Pluses. Plus, great to see Joshua back, and also Kieran back. So great to see you both. So brilliant. My delta, yeah, I think my delta is that I didn't actually get around to starting up last week's monster properly, or at all, to be honest. I decided spending an hour finishing up the covers for Outbreak was more important than this week's monster, and I think we had a good meeting anyway, but still wish I'd done it. So brilliant. So that's what we are. That's this week's brainstorming done. We'll be back next week. We'll be getting introduced to Joshua's new world or universe and coming up with some monster concepts for that. So join us next week, 7 o'clock UK time on Friday. So from us and all of us, bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.